Welcome to a special edition of Inside Tennessee. I'm one of your moderators, John Becker. This is your other, John North. We're pleased to have you with us. And let me introduce our guest and then our panel. With us today is Dr. Mark O'Gorman of Maryville College, professor of political science. Always good to see you.
Thanks for being here.
Yes, Don Bosch is on the end. He is a Democrat and runs his own law firm.
You said that with a frightening tone. Good day, good day.
And Susan Richardson-Williams is a Republican. She runs her own PR firm.
Good morning.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good
Whatever
evening.
it is.
Hello,
Yes.
yes.
Exactly. Whatever time you're watching us.
We hope the sun
On
is
your streaming
shining
app.
wherever you are.
All right,
That's
here's the question we brought in the professor to answer. Can you trust polls? And Professor, the answer is the most popular, it depends.
Yep, it depends. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it depends on the poll. You have to make sure that you're a good consumer of polls, because polls are at best snapshots of what's going on either at the national level or in a specific state at a moment in time. If you're doing it well, hopefully over a 3 or 4 day period, a polling firm has gotten together hopefully about 1,200 respondents from the population they're surveying. Could be the state of Tennessee, could be the nation. And as a result of that, they can put out, candidly, what's called a snapshot. That's that top line number you see. However, where you have to be a good consumer, that top line number always has a bit of a margin of error, usually plus or minus 3%. So say that right now, usually you're seeing a 1 to 2% difference between the two candidates. That 1 to 2% difference could be magnified by 3% either direction, suggesting that any poll within 3 or 4% of each other, Trump's ahead by 3, Harris ahead by 3, really it's dead even, because the margin of error that has to be part of the snapshot is saying we're not sure.
And you teach polling in your class
Yes.
at Maryville College. Let's give our viewers a bit of a history lesson in how we came to rely on polling. How did that develop and now receive so much attention? The horse race is really what people focus on.
It is, yes. Back 80, 90 years ago, we weren't doing professional polling at all. We probably have to wait, the one benchmark is right after World War II, the 1948 election, if we're going to geek into this with history. During that time, Thomas Dewey, the Republican, was running against the challenger and the incumbent, Harry Truman. Everyone thought Dewey was going to win, and they were polling into early October, and then they stopped. And the biggest change that happened was in those final 3 weeks. Truman was from like 10 points down and came out in the upset win. That famous picture of him holding up the newspaper.
A lot of ink and paper wasted that
Exactly,
evening.
yes. Dewey defeats Truman, or yes, and then it's the exact opposite.
Chicago Tribune, they still talk about that.
You
paper.
got it, that's right. And so ever since then, both at the public side, which I'd say be like your television places, would be putting out polls and making sure that that happens since then. And now the professionalism of this is recognizing we can get polling organizations to help with a lot of different campaigns, both at the state level and the local level. It really has become kind of its own kind of cottage industry.
It's an industry for sure.
I really want to ask you this real quick in terms of the methodology or the way that it's done these days. A lot of people may think it's still done by phone, and that may not necessarily be true. I have seen interviews, and Susan and I were talking about this off camera, that actually people are doing it by online. What does that mean, and how does that work?
Right, the online is sometimes kind of called like IVR, interface voice recognition. It's a mix of online plus the real live callers. But the idea is the fact that they're trying, the polling firm, are trying to get as many people as possible to respond, and they know, and especially in our recent times, no one's real excited about picking up a phone that has a number that's unknown. And so with the computerized system of what they call IVR, you can get thousands more or at least attempts out there over a certain period of time, and as a result you might be able to hit that what's called response rate, because you really want to make sure over that 3 day period you're hitting 1,200, 1,500, and they know that computers don't sleep. Computers don't need to drink water. You can just keep firing away. Usually you've got a human keeping track of it, but that usually ups the number of attempts. Hopefully you're getting a good result.
I'm going to let Don and Susan in just a second,
Sure.
but I just want to underline this before we go to break. The advent of the cell phone really evolved this industry, forced it to change, and forced us to be better consumers.
I think so, yes, because it was all landline in the olden days. My time, I remember that being young with a landline. But now with cell phones, you now have homes that might have multiple lines. And now to what extent, if, say, for example, a polling firm buys all the phone numbers in Tennessee, probably 2 out of 3 of those are now a cell phone because people just don't have landlines anymore. And now you're in a place where so many people are very choosy in who they take a call from, and as a result that's transformed it, forcing the computerization of it more and more.
All right, we're going to be back with questions from Don and Susan. A quick break here on Inside Tennessee. Back with more of our conversation about polling in the modern era. Back on this special edition of Inside Tennessee, Professor and Dr. Marco Gorman with Maryville College is our guest, talking about polling. And Susan, you lead us off.
Well, push polling has been something that I've been very familiar with.
That's not polling, that's campaigning.
It's
Go
campaigning,
on.
and there is bias in polling. How do you differentiate? How do you know that when you get the call and you want to answer a poll? What do you watch for?
If you're the one who's answering the phone, you're starting to listen to the types of questions you're getting from the pollster. If those questions are just very neutral, who are you supporting in this year's election, what might be your top issue, that's fine. But if suddenly you get language like, do you really like that so-and-so? And you start seeing like adjectives talking about how good or how bad the other person is or how good that one is, that's your trigger.
If you knew that,
Do you support killing babies?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. As soon as you do
that.
that, candidly, you should hang up because you're getting a poll that is as much campaigning as it is trying to get real data.
So, Mark, let me ask, and one of the things I've sort of really grown interested in your field since 2020, and I've always followed it, but the low propensity voter and the ability of pollsters to predict which group of low propensity voters are going to come out. We saw it in 2016 with Trump. The low people that didn't vote, they were registered, but they don't vote, and they came out in a wave and pushed Trump over the edge.
That's right.
It strikes me that as important for your industry, how do you pick who's the hot flavor of the month, low propensity voter that's going to sway an election? Because I have a pretty good idea in this election, but is there truth to that, and what can you do to sort of identify that right group?
Yeah, we do have low propensity voter groups. What usually a polling organization is trying to do some weighting. In other words, what they know is like, okay, right now probably rural voters, pick a swing state like Pennsylvania, rural voters, that's a key demographic that we want to get to if you're the polling organization. However, they just are reluctant to call and they just might be the first one to hang up or not even to respond. You need to, so to speak, bake that in or factor that into your poll to make sure that if that's the group you're trying to get to, you need to make sure that you're using every one of the responses from that rural group and maybe giving it extra weight. For example, say we had a poll that was 60% male, 40% female. That's wrong. There's more women or men who vote, more women than men in the United States. You got to make sure that you have to give them, so to speak, equal weight or change not the sampling, but the weighting to make sure. And so back to your group, I know rural voters are definitely a very key low propensity group right now, not just in every state, including Tennessee, but also in the swing states, because we know they seem to have been consistent Republican voters, and everyone's wondering, will they come out in 24.
What about younger voters? That seems to be like the golden
low
fleece.
propensity
Yeah.
group.
Sure
That
is.
early polling seems to be showing that those numbers are up nationwide.
That's right. Yeah. They definitely are, and more voting is occurring. What I think everyone's scratching their head at is the fact that we were dealing with 4 months ago 2 old candidates, and no young person was excited about either one. And then when Joe Biden did that amazing thing during the summer and said no, and suddenly Kamala Harris is into this like 100-day snap election, now we're in a place where does the age factor impact the young group? Is 60 young enough? Donald Trump 78. Does age even have a factor? And then beyond that, the issues that young people are thinking about. Different set of issues for a 20-something versus a 60-something is carrying them into the voting booth.
If you look at some of the early voting numbers, what's your sense? Do you think, and you visit with young voters every day, what's your sense just anecdotally, again, what you think?
In terms of the issues, the students we're seeing at Maryville College and also just around, clearly the issues you're seeing nationally are very important to them. The economics is important, probably at a micro level. Can I get a job? Not necessarily thinking about big picture. I do think among younger women, reproductive health issues are very key, and so that's one that I think both sides need to be very attuned to in terms of how they make their arguments, but more importantly, how pollsters ask the questions to make sure they're getting a valid response. Beyond that, issues such as immigration are important. I don't think in Tennessee they have the resonance to say like a border state would. University of Texas, that'd be probably more important.
Do you get a sense that more younger voters are going out that you interact with and actually casting a ballot?
Yes, I think that's the one transformation that's probably happened is with the second half of the summer. I think you're getting more younger voters, and usually more younger voters will turn out Democrat. If you do it from past years, it's about 60-40. They kind of go blue, and so if you're a Democratic candidate, you're looking at that, wondering that might help you in terms of the ballot box. However, if that issue is still the economy, I know the economy is a #1 issue, and that seems to favor the Republican candidates because they're concerned. The Democrats have a more difficult time to explain their way out of a
To
troubling
speak of your
economy.
polls, I mean, right now, Harris now is virtually tied with Trump on the economy, which is
yes.
a switch that we have not seen in
That's right, yeah,
many cycles of
That's right.
presidents.
And I'm going to give
Susan,
her a chance.
You're looking at everything with a skeptical eye these days.
Because she's just hoping, but of course she's not going to buy it.
No, I have talked about for a long time this issue of reproductive rights and abortion, because that has been a concern of mine since the decision from
For
the
your
Supreme
party.
Court, for my party.
Right.
And I've been watching Downtown West and looking at the lines, trying to see if there are more women, younger women in the lines. I haven't noticed that, to be honest. And they are a group that don't generally vote.
That's not a very good statistical way to poll, by
I'm
the way.
aware of
Driving
that.
by
Just
downtown
anecdotal.
West.
I'm totally aware of that.
Okay.
But Knox County has an increase in early voting. We've had a significant increase. Not true in other parts of the state. It isn't over east and it is in Knox County, but not true in Shelby and Hamilton or Davidson, for instance. But
Oh, actually, I think it is up in Davidson. If I recall.
no,
I'm
it
sorry.
is not.
Yeah,
No, it is
So,
not.
so maybe that's right.
But I am curious about, you're saying that about the younger voters, because, you know, they are buying gas, they're having to buy groceries and all of those things too. So I'm happy that the economy is an issue with them. But yeah, I'm very curious when all of this shakes out. Did women in record numbers go to the polls? Did that abortion make a difference? Because that's just something that I think is really going to impact our party.
We'll get some more perspective on that. John and I had an interview with a gentleman with the Beacon Center who you've heard from before, Mark Cunningham. We're going to have more of that. A quick break here on Inside Tennessee. We're back with that conversation. Back on this special edition of Inside Tennessee. Again, our guest is Dr. Mark O'Gorman. He's a professor at Maryville College of Political Science. Our discussion is all about polling, and John and I had the opportunity to talk to somebody who is intimately familiar with that. That is Mark Cunningham, who is helping talk about the poll with the Beacon Center based in Nashville. Here's that conversation, and then we'll react to it. Colleague John North and I are back with Mark Cunningham. The Beacon Center of Tennessee is one that has started polling and has had several under their belt. So, Mark, it's great to talk to you about why we should trust polling. Let's just talk for a moment about what stands out about your latest poll that dropped earlier in October.
Yeah, I mean, the presidential election is obviously very contested. And actually, what stood out to me was how much better Kamala Harris did than Joe Biden in the poll. There's a 7-point difference between if Joe Biden were still the nominee and Harris, which doesn't seem like a lot because she's still down 21 in Tennessee. But when you think about the people she's bringing over in states like North Carolina or Georgia, she's bringing over Republicans and she's bringing over women who were not willing to vote for Joe Biden. So ultimately, I think we all know what Tennessee is. It's probably not going to be very contested, but that was a tidbit that came out where it shows you that, you know, Democrats made the right choice moving away from Biden and picking Vice President Harris.
John North's going to have some specific questions, but just more broadly, Mark, we see a lot of polling chatter back and forth about what you can trust and what you can't trust. Can you trust polling?
You can trust some polling. You certainly cannot trust other polling. I think when you look at polling, you know, it needs to be in a holistic way. You shouldn't say, oh, this one poll shows my candidate winning. And that's what partisans on both sides do. They take the one poll that shows them doing well. They don't look at historic precedent. They don't look at how it's done in the past. And they don't look at the transparency aspect. So ultimately, I would urge people not to just look at one poll. As much as I want everyone to read the Beacon poll, you know, there's a number of polls. And when you look at a site like 538, you know, what Nate Silver does in the Silver Bulletin, what they do is they show past, you know, precedent. They show the polls that are the most transparent, and they give them a higher margin. So, you know, something like the TIP poll is an A+ poll. That's much more relevant than a D- poll that you know, some Republican or some Democrats throwing out to make their candidate look better. So I would always urge people to look at the sites that compile them, not just, oh, we're going to put an average together, but they compile them based on how they have done in the past.
Mark, I want to ask you about two specific criticisms of late of polling, and I'll just tell you them up front. Failure to adequately represent sort of the lesser educated person out there who may vote. That's one criticism, that they don't tap in well enough into that. And the other, Mark, is that the so-called margin for error, you actually ought to say it's double what it's represented as. So it should be 5 or 6 or 6.5 or 7%, rather than what we traditionally hear as, to say, 3%. Can you respond to those two, what are seen as vulnerabilities?
Well, John, you are 100% right on both those points. When they talk about how off the polls were in 2016 and 2020, especially with this, this new group of people who are voting mostly because of President Trump, it is the education level that people never really understood. They said, oh, this is very similar, but the difference between specifically white college educated voters and white non-college educated public voters is substantial. And the polls did not capture the fact that Trump did so much better with these group of, working class people without college degrees than any Republican has done in the past. So that's something that's been a real problem. Pollsters like to think they captured in 2022. Now, Trump was not on the ballot, but most people in 2022 say that was the most accurate polling election we may have ever had. So they like to think they've done it. Now, Trump is a different animal, and I have no idea what's going to happen in this coming election, because he's so much different than any other candidate we've seen. But that is absolutely a vulnerability. And in terms of the margin of error, that's also correct. I mean, people say, it's a 2.83% margin of error. But when you look historically, only about 60% of polls have fallen within that margin of error, which that's the reason why, margin of error, it's good to, but that's why you need to focus on really good, strong polls. Because if you look at that, most of the polls at the top do fall within that margin of error. And, every once in a while, there's going to be an election that they get wrong. That needs to be acceptable. It's like betting a sports game, right? Yeah, a team should be favored by 7. They throw 4 interceptions and lose. Yeah, they lost that game, but it doesn't mean that the process was wrong in setting that line. So I think that this idea that pollsters need to be perfect is unrealistic, because it's an art and a science. So I think that, John, both your points are correct. And that's why every poll should be taken with a grain of salt, and looking at, averages is a much better way to do it.
One of the things that the Beacon Center has been credited with doing is the transparency of offering crosstabs and the order of the questioning. Is that something you would advise people looking at polls to look for?
I mean, I don't think you can take a poll seriously unless you are transparent and have crosstabs, because look, there's a lot of argument about who funds polls, right? You say, oh, this poll's funded by a Republican, this poll's funded by a Democrat, this is an internal poll. But guess what? None of that matters if you're being fully transparent, because you can see all the questions, you can see who is, what the voter demographic, isn't it? So who funds it is not relevant when you have all the information in front of people. The issue, with polls like Vanderbilt is they hide most of the stuff. We don't see the specific questions, you don't see the crosstabs, and you don't see who's polled, or even the specific questions. So I think that it's hard to take a poll seriously. And there's even some right-wing polls. I think Trafalgar is one that I think of on top of my head that actually has been pretty accurate in some of the numbers, but they're not transparent in how they do it. So when you're not transparent, it makes, you might have been lucky one election cycle, but that is not something that might continue happening. And we saw in 2022, it did not for them.
I want to put you on the spot. Set aside the Beacon poll, for whom you do so much work, and you've been pretty forthright about them. What is a go-to pollster for you? If I said, Mark, help me out here, who can I trust? If we put Beacon aside, who do you go to?
The New York Times Siena poll is a fantastic poll. It's been really good and all thing. And I got to credit my alma mater. The Marquette University poll is the top state pollster in the whole country. And they've done some national polling too. So those are good. And ABC News, the Washington Post, they normally do pretty good polls. Monmouth, Marist. I mean, there's a lot of great pollsters out there. I would just say if you see a poll that you look on 538 and they're kind of, under 1.5, it's probably not a very good poll. I kind of look at the 2 or better on 538. And generally, I will give that a lot more credence than other polls.
Mark Cunningham, we appreciate the time as always, the Beacon Center, and you can go to their website to see the latest poll. Again, appreciate your time.
Thank you both.
And we're back for our discussion. Professor, what do you make of his note there that polling is both an art and a science?
Yes, it is. It's both. I mean, you're going to be doing all the methodology behind it. He was talking about the transparency, making sure you see the questions and making sure you as the consumer can see all the backstory, so to speak, kind of what's behind the top numbers. But in terms of the art, back to the earlier comments in terms of if you don't have that gift in terms of figuring out what's that group that we haven't touched on yet, non-college educated person, whatever that group is in whatever state, if you can't figure out the best way to weight them or find them, then your poll is incomplete. And I think that's where the art can be, who can make that magic weighting factor work.
We're going to have some closing thoughts. We'll be right back on Inside Tennessee. Stay with us. We're back with a special edition of Inside Tennessee talking about polling and whether you can trust it. And Susan, you have a question.
I do. Talking about transparency in polling, if I get a call from a polling firm, and they start asking me questions. Should I ask them questions? Should I say, who's paying for this poll? Who do you represent? Where are you know, what entity are you? Should those of us being polled be more aggressive, I guess, in finding those questions
And
out?
just so you know, Mark, Susan thinks the computer will talk back to her.
No, I don't, but go ahead.
You can always ask if it's not a live poll, then you might not get an answer.
Right.
On the part of it, if it's a live person, they might have a response, but again, they're probably dealing with the screen in front of them where they have the questions. They might not
Right.
be able to deal with that. What you're hoping is that they tell you exactly what organization they're with.
Right.
Hi, I'm with Beacon Research and I'm doing a poll. Can I ask you questions? If you don't hear that up front,
They don't always do that,
exactly.
though, up
But
front.
and then that's the yellow flag or red
Yeah.
flag. They don't say it up front because that's part of the transparency at the end. We're a real live group. We're an organization trying to get your input because hopefully they're trying to keep you on the line. If they start being vague with you in the questions,
Hang up.
Exactly. Yeah. So.
So, Mark, Tennessee historically has been out on the red edge of polling and candidates and people that win. How different, or how is it more difficult to poll in a state like Tennessee that really skews towards one side, or is it more difficult to poll in those states that one might think might be tougher because they're in the center? The margin of error might become more in play.
I think both types of states have their own challenges. I think, for example, in Tennessee, relatively red state, I still think you're trying to figure out to what extent you can get an accurate hard count. Like right now, we have a sense that probably Trump will be successful in Tennessee, but you'd want to know what that hard number is because of all of a sudden on election night, Harris is creeping up inside that plus 20. Something's going on.
Yeah, margins matter.
Yeah, margins matter. And then on the purple states, the states of those swing states, then the challenge is even more so. I'm thinking of North Carolina right now.
Sure.
In the whole world, every polling organization is trying to figure out how do we contact Western North Carolina after Helene, the horror of what they went through. You can't, but you know if you don't, because they literally don't have a phone, how do you capture that sample? That's the challenges for the swing states because that's just one of many challenges inside a complex state versus one that's more predictable.
You started out by telling us that we should look at polls as a snapshot of that moment in time. And so it's not a predictor. What comes out on October 24 is not a predictor of November 5. I did see one academic expert, I think out of California, who said something which seemed helpful in terms of what you could do with a poll, and that's look at the trends in terms of if a particular candidate is trending better, that might be a better indication. What do you think about that?
Yes, but yes, you can, because over time, because now in the modern age we have so many polls, you suddenly don't have those occasional snapshots. It feels like you're like watching one of those old films, and you'd see everything. So you think you have better quality. However, you have to make sure you have that grain of salt thinking, because every one of those polls, every one of those dots has that plus or minus 3. So suddenly you just might get in a place where like, you just get three in a row polls that show a trend going one way or the other, but if all three of those aren't correct, suddenly that whole week's worth of polling is off. So it's still, you have to be skeptical. The trend does tell you something, but you probably have to wait for the next poll to see if it confirms something.
How much do you think methodology's improved from sort of the debacle, we'll call it that, of 2016 and how widely off the polls were to what we are now? I mean, has that methodology gotten better, and are polls, to the extent they are something beyond a snapshot, as John has just said, are they a little more reliable of a predictor as to what might happen?
They are better now than they were in 20 and 22 is pretty good. Where the concern is the fact that we are probably going to have very spot-on national polls by the end because we're just dealing with a much wider population. However, it's going to be those state polls that are candidly all over the map. When you talked about, the gentleman was from Beacon was talking about Marquette, they are an elite group that does state polling. You really want to watch them to see where they're going. But then in the state polls, for example, I saw 2 polls last week that, don't mean to giggle, I saw +6 Trump, +4 Harris, 2 days apart, Georgia. That's no help.
No.
Yeah.
I would say their sample pools were quite a bit different in each of
exactly.
those polls.
So we've got to dive in and look at the methodology,
That's right.
but you can see it's still a struggle.
Finally, Professor, I want to get your take on the horse race. And to our viewers out there who can get really focused on who's up and who's down, does it depress depress turnout sometimes if you see a poll where your team member is down by 20 points? You're like, why does my vote matter?
Yeah, yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, yes, it can. I mean, and that's the blessing and curse of the horse rate thinking. It was a man I studied under, Tom Patterson, who created that idea. And he talked about that fact that while captures our attention in terms of looking at that from kind of the way we think about who's ahead, who's behind. But all of a sudden, if you start to see that trend, the dots of the dots suggesting, uh-oh, my person's not going to make it, you suddenly, not only do you lose the energy in the voting booth, but right now in this vital 2-week period where both parties are racing to try to get out the vote, if suddenly you see a trend that suggests, you're not going to get out the vote, you're not going to volunteer that extra time. So it's a concern always.
Well, we hope that our viewers engage who have seen this with a little bit more education under their belts. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Marco Gorman, Don, Susan, always good to have you. John, thank you. And we hope to see you for election night on WBIR. We'll be across all platforms, and we'll look forward to seeing you then, if not before. Have a great day.